Weaving on the Schacht Inkle Loom with Jane Patrick. A Schacht Spindle Company Inc. Edu video. An Inkle Loom is a special loom used to weave bands. It is easy to use and it is a great way to learn to weave in almost no time. The Schacht Inkle Loom is an open-sided loom which makes it very easy to use. This is the Schacht Inkle Loom. The tension peg slides back and forth in the slot and is used to adjust the tension. These are the warp pegs around which the yarns, called warp threads, travel around. This bottom peg is called the heddle peg and is used to hold the heddles. Here are the tools and equipment you'll need for inkle weaving. The Schacht Inkle Loom, a belt shuttle, strong yarn or string such as cotton carpet warp, yarn for weaving, a smooth shiny yarn such as pearl cotton makes beautiful bands, masking tape, and scissors. This is a belt shuttle, which is a special kind of stick shuttle with one beveled edge. A belt shuttle has two purposes. It carries the weft back and forth as well as used to beat in the weft. You wind the belt shuttle in a figure 8. First, just wrap the tail of the yarn around the end of the shuttle a couple of times to secure it, then wind across the broad edge, not the beveled edge, of the shuttle. Wind as much yarn on the shuttle as feels comfortable to you. The less yarn on the shuttle, the more often you'll have to stop and wind the shuttle, but too much yarn can feel bulky in your hand. Before you begin weaving, you will need to make string heddles. This is how I make heddles. First, I measure a sample heddle around pegs B, 1, and 5, leaving enough length to comfortably tie a double knot. I then use this length as a guide to measure string for the number of heddles I will need, in this example, 35. After I've cut all the heddle lengths, I then tie all the heddles around pegs B, 1, and 5. Tying the heddle knot is a two-step process. I like to use a surgeon's knot because it stays in place and doesn't loosen after it is tied. This will help you make all of your heddles the same length, which you will discover is important when you begin to weave. Secure the surgeon's knot with a square knot. You will know that you did not tie this knot correctly because it will come untied, a very annoying thing to happen when you're weaving. I suggest you tie one heddle and then pull on it. If the knot holds and doesn't slip, you have tied it correctly. After you've measured all of your heddles, trim the ends with a pair of scissors. Remove the heddles from the loom. You are now ready to put the warp yarns on the loom. This is called warping. The first step in warping is to decide what your pattern should be. For this project, I planned the color pattern shown here. The H stands for the heddle thread and the O stands for the open thread or a thread not secured by a heddle. For this example, I'm using 5/2 cotton in 5 colors. I'll begin by winding 5 threads of ruby glint, R in the diagram, working right to left. You may find it helpful to print out the threading guide from our website. You'll find it on page 2 of our Spring 2008 online newsletter. Just go to www.schachtspindle.com. If you'd like to receive our free quarterly online newsletter, you can subscribe to it on the website. To begin, gather all of the supplies you will need. It is most convenient to place your loom on the table and the cone or ball of yarn on the floor. Set the tension bar in the middle of the slot. This will allow you to increase and decrease the tension during weaving. Begin with ruby glint. Tape a generous tail to the side of the loom opposite the tension peg. Go over the top peg and around all the other pegs, ending at the tension peg. Temporarily secure your working end by winding it around the tension peg a couple of times. Fold a heddle in half over this warp thread with a knot on the bottom and slip it under the heddle peg. Wind the second warp thread in the same way, except this time go under the top peg instead of on top of the peg. This thread is called the open thread because it is left free and is not held by the heddle. Except for this first peg, follow the same path as you did with the first heddle. The third warp thread follows the same path as the first warp thread. You begin by going over the top peg and then around all the other pegs, ending at the tension peg. Temporarily wind the warp around this peg and install the next heddle as you did the first heddle. Placing the knot on the bottom under the peg means that the knot won't get caught in the warp during weaving. The fourth warp follows the same path as the second warp. You first pass under the top peg, then follow the same path as the other warp threads. This warping pattern never varies. What does change, and where all the fun is in the color changes. By winding colors in different patterns, you can create designs. You always change colors at the tension peg. Though there are different ways to do this, this is my method. I cut off the yarn I'm stopping with and tie on the new one to it in an overhand knot, getting as close as I can to the tension peg. When two colors are alternating, you can measure them together. Just hold them together, placing one above the peg and one below the peg. This also has the advantage of speeding up the warping process. In this case, ruby glint is on top. The caution when measuring two warps together is to be sure to place the heddle in the correct place. You want to make sure threads pass alternately above and below the peg. In other words, heddle and open threads must always alternate. After you've measured all of your warp threads, check your work before tying off the yarn. When you are satisfied all is as it should be, remove the masking tape and tie the beginning warp thread to the ending warp thread in a square knot at the tension peg. Congratulations! Way to go! Hooray! You have just finished warping. Now you're ready to weave. Before beginning to weave, check the tension. First, loosen the tension peg and pull back on it to tighten up the tension. You want as much tension as possible. Practice making the shed. The shed is the opening you make for the shuttle to pass through. When you start to make the sheds with your hands, you'll see why the Inkle Loom is so clever, even though it's a very simple construction. To make the sheds for your shuttle, you will alternately push down, then up on the warp threads behind the heddles to make the two sheds for weaving. Look at the loom from the side to see the openings. To make a base for weaving and to spread the warp to the correct width, weave the first shed. Leave a 2-inch tail of yarn hanging out at the edge. Place your shuttle through the shed, but don't press it into place yet. Make the second shed and weave back. Now press in the weft. To secure the weft tail, just insert it into this shed. You'll clip it in the end after you've removed your band from the loom. Now draw the warps closer together so that they cover the weft. You want the warps to be touching but not pulled together so closely that they start to bunch up. Inkle weaving is warp faced. That is, the warp completely covers the weft. The only place you should see the weft is at the edge or the selvage. This warp face fabric makes a sturdy band, and also because the weft is covered, the only element you'll see in the design is what you've threaded in the warp. Open the shed, insert the shuttle, pull the warp through, keeping an eye on the selvage edge. You want the weft to be snug against the edge. You don't want to leave a loop or pull so tightly that the sides draw in. This takes practice. Do not worry if your edges are a little wavy at first. They will improve with practice. After I pass the shuttle through to the other side, I change the shed. Insert the shuttle and press down on the previous row and then continue on to the other side, pulling the weft snugly against the selvage. I change sheds, insert the shuttle, beat, and so on. Pretty soon you will develop a weaving rhythm that is very pleasant. After a couple of inches of weaving, you'll need to advance the warp. To do this, loosen the tension bar to release the tension on the warp, then using both hands, grab the warp and pull towards you. You want to advance the warp just a couple of inches. Retighten the warp tension by pulling forward on the tension knob and tighten the knob. You can weave until all the warp that can be woven is woven. To secure the weaving, place a tapestry or a large-dyed needle in the shed in the next to the last shed, with the eye pointing out to the same side from which your shuttle enters the shed. Change sheds and weave back. Cut off the yarn from the shuttle, leaving a tail. Thread this tail through the needle and draw the end through the shed. To remove your band from the loom, just cut it off. If your band has fringe, cut the warp so that equal lengths of the warp are left at either end of the band. Congratulations! You're now a weaver.